The sharp bang of Commander Wilson's gavel cut through the crowded veterans' benefit auction like a gunshot. 8-year-old Maddie Sullivan flinched, but held her ground, clutching a small wooden box painted with American flags against her chest, the loose change inside jingling faintly with her trembling hands. Her wide hazel eyes, red-rimmed from crying since dawn, darted anxiously between the numbered bidding paddles, rising around her like a forest of obstacles. Each new bid felt like another barrier between her and the only living piece of her father. She had left. $12,000, announced the auctioneer, his voice echoing through the suddenly stifling VFW hall. Do I hear $13,000? Across the room, separated by a sea of unfamiliar faces in military dress uniforms and business attire, sat Atlas, the Belgian Malinois who had been her father's military working dog and closest companion for 3 deployments, had his ears pricked forward, dark amber eyes locked onto Maddie's small form. When the dog's temporary handler tugged on his leash, Atlas whined and pulled forward, straining toward the little girl with such obvious intent that several heads turned to witness the connection. Aunt Rebecca wrapped a protective arm around Maddie's narrow shoulders as fresh tears spilled down the child's freckled cheeks. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about the only remaining link to her father, the only creature who still carried Captain Michael Sullivan's memory in every cell of his being, the only one who had been there during those final moments overseas that had stolen her father. Forever. And with each new bid, that connection was slipping further away, beyond her reach, just like her dad had 18 months ago. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with where you're watching from. The narrator's voice announced. Now, let's continue with this incredible story. Captain Michael Sullivan had been a legend in military working dog handler circles. His instinctive understanding of canine psychology and unflinching courage had made him one of the most requested handlers for high-risk operations. For 6 years, he and his previous canine partner had conducted successful missions across 3 continents, saving countless lives by detecting IEDs and providing critical tactical support to special operations units. When that dog retired, due to injury, Michael had been paired with Atlas, a young Belgian Malinois with extraordinary intelligence and drive. Their connection had been immediate and profound, the kind of handler-dog bond that trainers at Lackland Air Force Base pointed to when teaching new handlers what was possible. Together, they had completed 2 full deployments with commendations for their work in explosive detection and patrol operations. To Maddie and her mother Elena, however, they were simply Dad and Atlas, the inseparable pair who filled their modest Virginia home with energy, stories, and unconditional love during the precious months between deployments. Maddie had grown up watching her father work with Atlas in their backyard, her eyes wide with admiration as the powerful dog responded to commands so subtle they seemed like telepathy. Atlas had been there for her too, tolerating clumsy toddler hugs, and later as she grew, becoming her confidant and protector when her father was deployed. The July morning in 2021 that shattered their world had begun like dozens before it. Michael kissed Elena goodbye at the door, knelt to hug Maddie tightly, and whistled for Atlas to follow him to the waiting transport. 18 days into that deployment, 2 officers in dress uniforms appeared at their front door. Captain Sullivan had been killed during a night operation, giving his life to save his unit after they encountered an unexpected ambush. Atlas, though injured, had survived. The trauma embedded itself differently in each of them. Elena retreated into work, taking extra shifts at the hospital where she served as a nurse, her medical training becoming both shield and distraction from the grief that threatened to consume her. Maddie, once bubbling with her father's same infectious enthusiasm, grew incrementally quieter with each passing week, until Dr. Bennett confirmed what her teachers had already noticed. The once talkative child had developed selective mutism, speaking only to her mother and only when absolutely necessary. Atlas, meanwhile, was treated for his injuries at a military veterinary facility before being returned to service under a different handler. Reports filtered back through Michael's former unit that the dog, once exemplary in his duties, had become inconsistent in his performance. Not aggressive or disobedient, but somehow diminished, as if his heart was no longer fully engaged in the work. The first time Maddie saw Atlas after her father's death was 6 months later, during a memorial ceremony at Fort Belvoir. The dog, standing at attention beside his new handler, spotted Maddie across the parade ground. Witnesses later described how Atlas's entire demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward, his body tensed, and despite his rigorous training, he broke position, dragging his handler several steps toward the Sullivan family before being brought under control. Military protocol prevented interaction during the formal ceremony, but afterward, Maddie was allowed a supervised visit. The moment remains etched in Elena's memory, her silent daughter dropping to her knees as Atlas approached, burying her face in his fur as the disciplined military dog stood perfectly still, allowing this breach of his training. More remarkable was what happened next, captured on Elena's phone, Maddie's lips moving, whispering words into Atlas's ear that no adult had heard from her in months. That visit became the first of many. Through the compassionate intervention of Michael's former commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, monthly visits were arranged at the training facility. Each time, staff reported the same phenomenon, Atlas's performance metrics improving, dramatically on days when he knew Maddie was coming, and Maddie speaking quiet words that only the dog could hear. "It's the anchor point theory," the military veterinarian explained to Elena after observing 3 such visits. Both Maddie and Atlas experienced the same loss. They recognize in each other a shared connection to Captain Sullivan that no one else can fully understand. For working dogs who lose their handlers, having an anchor point, someone who represents continuity, can be crucial for their psychological well-being. For Maddie, these visits became the fixed points around which her diminished world revolved. She maintained a calendar on her bedroom wall, carefully marking off days until she could see Atlas again. On visit days, she would clutch her father's dog tags, now kept on a chain sized for her small frame, as they drove to the facility. The transformation that occurred during these reunions astonished everyone who witnessed them. Maddie's rigid posture would soften, her perpetual frown would ease, and though most adults couldn't hear her words, the military handlers would see her lips moving as she shared secrets with Atlas, who listened with the focused attention that had made him an exceptional working dog. Last Christmas, during a particularly meaningful visit, a staff member captured security footage that brought Elena to tears when she viewed it later. The silent video showed Maddie reading from The Night Before Christmas, her expression animated as Atlas rested his head in her lap, both of them illuminated by the facility's holiday decorations. It was the only confirmation they had that Maddie retained the ability to form complete sentences, to read aloud, to express herself beyond the minimal communication she now used with her mother. These thoughts raced through Eleanor's mind as she watched the auction paddles continue to rise, each bid driving the price beyond anything they could hope to match. The military had finally made the difficult decision to retire Atlas. At 7 years old, with increasingly frequent episodes of what handlers called selective responsiveness, and after sustaining a second minor injury during training, the once elite working dog no longer met the rigorous standards required for military deployment. In most circumstances, military working dogs were offered first to their handlers for adoption. But with Michael gone, Atlas fell under a different protocol. Due to his exceptional training and bloodline, he was deemed valuable enough for the Military Working Dog Foundation's benefit auction, where his sale would support programs for veterans' families just like their own. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Elena. The auction, whose proceeds would help families like hers, was simultaneously taking away the one connection that had kept her daughter anchored to hope. When the announcement arrived, delivered by Colonel Harrison himself during one of their monthly visits, Elena had immediately begun researching their options. The colonel had been sympathetic, but clear. The decision had been made at levels beyond his influence. The best he could offer was to ensure they had the opportunity to bid, though he had warned them that military working dogs of Atlas's caliber typically commanded prices upwards of $15,000 at such auctions. "He's not just a dog, James," Elena had implored, using the first-name privilege granted by years of family friendship. "He's the only thing keeping Maddie connected to the world. You've seen how she is with him." Colonel Harrison had nodded, his military bearing softening slightly in acknowledgement of the personal rather than professional nature of their conversation. "I have submitted statements from both the veterinary staff and Dr. Bennett regarding the therapeutic value of their bond, but the Foundation has procedures, Elena. These auctions fund critical services." What Harrison hadn't said, what he didn't need to say because Elena already knew, was that Michael would have wanted the auction to proceed. Her husband had been devoted to supporting the families of fallen comrades. He would have understood the greater good being served, even at personal cost. That knowledge, however, did nothing to ease the weight of watching her daughter's silent suffering as the auction date approached. Maddie had taken to carrying a photograph of her father and Atlas everywhere, sleeping with it under her pillow, studying it with an intensity that worried both Elena and Dr. Bennett. "This is a significant setback," the child psychologist had explained after attempting to engage Maddie, who sat motionless during their session, staring at the photograph rather than responding to gentle questions. "The selective mutism has been resistant to traditional therapeutic approaches, but her connection with Atlas represents our most promising avenue for recovery." Dr. Bennett had carefully arranged her notes before continuing, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine concern. The trauma of losing her father became manageable for Maddie only through her relationship with Atlas. He's not just a dog to her. He's continuity, safety, and the last tangible connection to Captain Sullivan. From a clinical perspective, I believe their separation would significantly impede her recovery trajectory. That assessment had propelled Elena into action. That night, after Maddie had finally fallen asleep clutching her father's dog tags, Elena sat at the kitchen table, determination hardening into resolve. Her sister Rebecca's suggestion that they could find another dog, perhaps even another retired military dog, had been met with a cold stare that needed no verbal response. With shaking fingers, Elena had created a GoFundMe page titled, "Help Maddie Keep Her Father's Legacy." She uploaded a photo of Maddie with Atlas from their last visit, the only recent picture where her daughter's face showed anything approaching peace. "I don't care what it takes," she whispered to the empty kitchen, the gleaming medal case containing Michael's posthumously awarded Silver Star catching the dim light. "That dog is coming home where he belongs." The GoFundMe campaign had launched. At midnight, Elena's fingers trembling as she pressed publish. By dawn, their extended network of military families, hospital colleagues, and hometown friends had already contributed $200. A promising start, but nowhere near the estimated value of a fully trained military working dog with Atlas's credentials. Elena shared the link across social media platforms and sent personal messages to everyone in Michael's old unit. Within 48 hours, the campaign had been shared over 400 times and raised just over $3,500. The military community, always ready to support their own, had responded with typical solidarity. On the third day, a local reporter who specialized in veteran affairs picked up the story. Daughter of fallen hero seeks reunion with father's military dog, ran with a photograph of Maddie from happier days, sitting between her father and Atlas on the steps of their home. The article captured the heartbreak of Maddie's condition and the therapeutic value of her bond with Atlas, including statements from Dr. Bennett about the potential psychological impact of separating them. What Elena hadn't anticipated was the controversy the article would ignite. By the following morning, the newspaper's online version had accumulated dozens of comments representing sharply divided opinions. "That poor child deserves to have her father's dog," wrote one commenter, while another argued, "Military working dogs require specialized handling. This is irresponsible. These aren't pets." Regional television stations picked up the story, and a segment on the evening news featured opinions from canine trainers, child psychologists, and military personnel. "These animals are trained to respond to threats with potentially lethal force," stated a retired military dog trainer. "Without proper ongoing handling, they can present serious risks, especially around children." This was immediately countered by Dr. Bennett herself, who had agreed to be interviewed. "The stability of maintaining emotional connections is paramount for children who've experienced profound loss. In Maddie's case, the potential benefits far outweigh the risks, particularly given her existing relationship with this specific dog." As public debate intensified, the GoFundMe total climbed to $7,890, still far short of what would likely be needed at auction, where trained military and police dogs often commanded premium prices from security firms and specialized breeding programs. Elena noticed with growing unease that another narrative was emerging in social media discussions. Questions about whether a single mother working full-time could properly manage a highly trained military dog, whether emotional appeals should override established protocols designed for both public safety and the dog's welfare. Some commenters, while sympathetic to Maddie's situation, suggested that private security firms or specialized handling facilities would provide better outcomes for Atlas. As the auction date drew closer, just 1 week away, a new potential bidder emerged who captured community attention. Nathan Blackwood, CEO of Caliber Security Solutions, a private firm specializing in high-end security services for corporate and diplomatic clients, made his interest in acquiring Atlas public during a business conference. Military working dogs. "With Atlas's training and bloodline are invaluable assets for specialized security operations," he stated when asked by a reporter about his interest in the upcoming auction. "Our firm is always looking to acquire exceptional animals for our protection programs. Of course, we're aware of the Sullivan family's emotional attachment, and we're exploring ways to potentially accommodate supervised visitation if we're successful." At auction, the offer, while presented as compassionate, felt hollow to Eleanor. Scheduled visits in a corporate facility would never replace the daily presence she knew Maddie needed. Moreover, she worried that Atlas himself would suffer in yet another transition to unfamiliar handlers and an environment far removed from the family connection he clearly sought during their visits. With just days remaining before the auction, the GoFundMe had plateaued at just under $9,500. Elena began selling personal possessions, jewelry, electronics, even Michael's beloved motorcycle, while community debate intensified beyond anything she could have anticipated. Maddie, oblivious to the adult machinations surrounding her future with Atlas, simply marked each passing day on her calendar, counting down to the auction that would determine whether the last living connection to her father remained in her life or disappeared into the corporate security world. Beyond her reach, like Michael himself, as news of the upcoming auctions spread throughout the military community, the story polarized into increasingly entrenched camps. The local diner near Fort Belvoir became an unofficial debate hall where morning coffee conversations inevitably turned to Sullivan's girl and that military dog. Veterans, active service members, military families, and civilian contractors all felt entitled to an opinion on what was rapidly becoming more than a simple auction. It had transformed into a referendum on the balance between protocol and compassion, regulations and human needs. The Metropolitan Herald devoted an entire Sunday feature to exploring the controversy, interviewing experts from various fields to examine the situation from multiple angles. The front-page headline asked, "More than a dog community divided over military canine's future. What precedent would we set by making an exception to established protocol?" asked retired General Thomas Fairchild in the Metropolitan Herald article. While the emotional appeal is undeniable, military procedures exist for legitimate reasons. These aren't arbitrary rules to be discarded when they become inconvenient. The general's perspective was echoed by several military administrators from neighboring bases, all emphasizing the liability concerns surrounding the placement of trained military working dogs in civilian homes. Their arguments centered on the specialized training these dogs received, training that included controlled aggression, tactical response to threats, and protective behaviors that required experienced handling. In stark contrast, the human interest section featured an interview with Staff Sergeant Damon Rodriguez, who had served alongside Captain Sullivan during his second deployment. "Atlas isn't just military property," he argued. "He's a living connection to an officer who gave his life in service. We talk about supporting Gold Star families. This is exactly what that should look like." His sentiment was shared by dozens of current and retired military personnel who had begun wearing small gold ribbons on their civilian attire to signify their support for Maddie's cause. The silent symbol appeared with increasing frequency around the base and in local businesses, a visual referendum on where individuals stood in the growing controversy. The medical community entered the debate when the regional chapter of the American Psychological Association issued a statement addressing the therapeutic value of animal connections for children experiencing trauma. While carefully avoiding specific mention of Maddie's case, the timing left little doubt about its relevance. Consistent emotional support systems, including bonded animals, can provide crucial stability during childhood trauma recovery. The statement read, "Disruption of such bonds should be approached with extreme caution and professional clinical assessment." Colonel Harrison found himself increasingly on the defensive as community pressure mounted. At a town hall meeting on base housing issues, he faced pointed questions that had nothing to do with the scheduled agenda. The Foundation's policy was implemented after thorough review and consultation with experts in both military working dog programs and veteran support services, he stated firmly. "While we sympathize with the Sullivan family's attachment to Canine Atlas, the precedent of allowing emotional appeals to override established protocol puts the entire program at risk. The auction proceeds will benefit many families of fallen service members, not just one." This pragmatic stance seemed callous to many, particularly when contrasted with footage of Maddie's monthly visits with Atlas, captured respectfully from a distance by news cameras. The silent child walking beside her mother, small fingers clutching her father's dog tags, but her entire demeanor transforming upon seeing the Belgian Malinois. These images spoke louder than policy documents or liability concerns. Local businesses began posting flyers supporting the GoFundMe campaign. Maddie's elementary school held a penny drive that raised nearly $700 from children emptying their piggy banks for their classmate. Teachers reported that students were bringing in dog treats for when Atlas comes to live with Maddie. Their childish certainty both touching and heartbreaking, given the uncertain outcome. Behind these public developments, Elena struggled with private challenges of her own. Her sister Rebecca, who had moved in with them after Michael's death to help with Maddie, grew increasingly concerned about the financial strain the potential purchase was creating. "You're selling Michael's things. working double shifts, and taking out loans, Rebecca observed one evening after Maddie had gone to bed. Even if you somehow raise enough for the auction, have you thought about the long-term costs? Military working dogs need specialized veterinary care, ongoing training, proper facilities, not to mention the liability insurance you'd need. Elena folded laundry with mechanical precision, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. I know the costs, Beck. I lived with a military dog handler for 10 years, and Michael was trained for this. He understood these animals in a way most people don't. Atlas knows me. He lived in our home between deployments. Rebecca sighed, her concern genuine despite her challenging questions. As Michael's secondary handler, not as his primary caretaker. There's a difference. You think I should give up? Eleanor said flatly, not a question but an accusation. I think you should consider whether this is truly what's best for Maddie in the long run, not just the immediate emotional need. And whether it's fair to Atlas to place him in a home without a trained handler. The conversation ended in strained silence, but Rebecca's questions lingered, joining Elena's own middle-of-the-night doubts that she refused to acknowledge in daylight hours. Was she pursuing this for Maddie, or to maintain her own connection? To Michael? Was she truly capable of providing what Atlas needed? The working dog had been Michael's passion and professional partner. Elena had loved Atlas for how he loved her husband and daughter, but had never handled him alone. These doubts multiplied when she received an unexpected call from Nathan Blackwood himself, requesting a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements regarding K9 Atlas. Against Rebecca's advice, Elena agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the hospital during her lunch break. Blackwood arrived precisely on time, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing attention from other patrons. Up close, he was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the disciplined physique of someone who maintained military fitness standards despite now operating in the civilian sector. Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for making time, he began, his tone professionally courteous. I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than through intermediaries, because I believe there's a solution that serves everyone's interests. Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, steeling herself. I'm listening. My company, Caliber Security, employs several former military handlers. Atlas would work with professionals who understand his training and capabilities. Blackwood leaned forward slightly. More importantly, we could establish a regular visitation schedule for your daughter, supervised interactions in a controlled environment with proper support staff present. So, basically what we already have, but on your terms rather than the military's, Elena replied. Blackwood smiled, acknowledging her directness. With important differences. The visitation would be guaranteed by contract, not subject to changing base commanders or military policies. Additionally, we'd establish a trust fund for Madison's education, a significant one, as part of our arrangement. The proposal caught Eleanor off guard. She had expected a straightforward business competitor at auction, not this blend of professional interest and personal negotiation. Why would you do that? I was a military working dog handler before founding Caliber, Blackwood revealed. I understand the bond Madison has with Atlas. I also understand that properly caring for an animal with his training requires resources and expertise that most civilian households simply don't have. Before Elena could respond, Blackwood continued, additionally, Atlas's bloodline and training represent a significant asset for our breeding program. Military working dogs with his credentials are increasingly rare. The arrangement would be mutually beneficial. Madison maintains her connection with Atlas, your family receives financial support, and Caliber gains valuable genetics for our program. The mention of a breeding program triggered an immediate resistance in Elena. Michael had always been adamantly opposed to the commercial breeding of working dogs, considering it exploitative unless conducted with rigorous attention to health, temperament, and proper placement. Atlas is a living connection to my daughter's father, not a genetic resource, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. I understand your perspective, Mrs. Sullivan. But consider this. Your GoFundMe campaign has stalled at less than $10,000. My company is prepared to bid significantly higher than that. Without being insensitive, you're a nurse and a single mother. The financial reality— Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwood, Elena interrupted, rising from her seat. I'll see you at the auction. The encounter left Elena shaken, not just by Blackwood's confidence, but by the grain of truth in his assessment. Their financial resources were limited, and growing more so with each personal item she sold to fund their bid. The practical challenges of providing Atlas with proper care were real, not simply concerns manufactured by those opposing their cause. That evening, unable to sleep, Elena found herself in Michael's home office, untouched since his death. The room remained exactly as he had left it. Reference books on canine training lining the shelves, framed photographs of Michael with his working dogs throughout his career, certificates from specialized handler courses mounted on the wall. His presence felt so tangible here that she had avoided the space, allowing dust to gather rather than disturb what felt like a memorial. Now, she methodically began reviewing his professional materials, searching for something— guidance, reassurance, or simply connection among the remnants of his military career. In the second drawer of his desk, beneath tactical manuals and training logs, she found a leather-bound journal she had never seen before. Opening it revealed Michael's distinctive handwriting, entries dated from his earliest handler assignments, through his partnership with Atlas. It wasn't a personal diary, but a professional record. Observations on working dog psychology, handling techniques, training breakthroughs, and challenges overcome. Michael had documented everything from Atlas's dietary preferences to his behavioral responses in different tactical situations. Elena read through the night, absorbing her husband's professional knowledge with the desperation of someone preparing for a crucial examination. The journal reflected not just Michael's expertise, but his profound respect for the animals he worked with, his understanding that effective handling required relationship, not just command. Dawn found her still at his desk, surrounded by open manuals and training guides, the journal central among them. Rebecca found her there, concern immediately replacing the lecture she had prepared about Eleanor's missed sleep. "What is all this?" she asked, surveying the organized chaos of materials. Elena looked up, exhaustion evident, but determination stronger. "If I'm going to be Atlas's handler, I need to understand what that truly means. These are Michael's records. Everything he knew about working with military dogs, specifically about Atlas, his training responses, health history, behavioral patterns." Rebecca picked up one of the manuals, scanning its technical contents with raised eyebrows. "You're serious about this?" Blackwood was right about one thing. Atlas needs a handler who understands him, not just someone who loves him. Elena tapped the journal. "Michael documented everything. It's all here. The commands Atlas responds to, his triggers, his strengths and weaknesses. I can learn this, Beck. I have to." The determination in Elena's voice gave Rebecca pause. For 18 months, she had watched her sister navigate grief with stoic functionality, working her shifts, caring for Maddie, maintaining their home with mechanical efficiency. This was different. This was passion and purpose returning to a woman who had been operating on duty alone since the officers appeared at their door. "You'll need help," Rebecca said finally, not an argument but an acknowledgement. I know, and it will change everything, your schedule, your home, your daily routines. I know that too. Rebecca studied her sister's face, recognizing the same stubborn commitment that had carried Elena through nursing school as a single mother before she met Michael, through multiple deployments and through the devastating aftermath of his death. "Then I guess we'd better get to work," she said, pulling up a chair beside Elena. "What do I need to know about Belgian Malinois?" The days before the auction transformed their home into an impromptu study center for military working dog handling. Elena contacted Michael's former colleagues, who responded with unexpected enthusiasm to her request for guidance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez arranged for her to observe training sessions at the base facility, standing beside her to explain techniques and protocols that Michael had used with Atlas. "The bond is already there," Rodriguez told her after watching footage of Maddie's visits with Atlas. "That's half the battle with these dogs. They're not machines. They form attachments, process grief, experience confusion when their routines change. Atlas recognizes your family as his pack. The rest is just learning to speak his language consistently." The retired handler, who had initially expressed concerns about placing military working dogs in civilian homes, reached out after reading follow-up articles about Elena's efforts. To her surprise, he offered conditional support. "Captain Sullivan was one of the best handlers I ever trained," he told her during a phone consultation. "If he kept detailed records as you described, and if you're committed to proper continuing education, it could work. These dogs can transition to civilian life successfully, but it requires knowledgeable handling and appropriate environmental management." His guidance was practical rather than emotional. Recommendations for secure fencing modifications to their yard, specialized equipment they would need, and a list of trainers experienced with retired military working dogs who could provide ongoing support. The fact-based approach was exactly what Elena needed to counterbalance the emotional weight of their campaign. Meanwhile, Maddie remained largely unaware of the adult complexities surrounding her future with Atlas. She continued her sessions with Dr. Bennett, who reported minor improvements in her willingness to communicate through writing and drawing, though her verbal communication remained limited to occasional necessary phrases with Elena and Rebecca. "She's drawing Atlas more frequently," Dr. Bennett noted during their weekly consultation. "And the drawings show them together in your home, everyday scenes of walking together, sleeping in her room. She's planning for his arrival whether or not she can verbalize it." The observation gave Elena renewed determination. Maddie was projecting her healing into a future that included Atlas, a future that now depended on their ability to outbid a corporate security firm with resources far beyond their own. 3 days before the auction, their GoFundMe received an unexpected boost when several members of Michael's former unit coordinated a social media campaign that brought national attention to their cause. A veterans motorcycle club organized a benefit ride that raised an additional $2,500, and a pet supply company pledged to match donations up to $5,000 for the final 48 hours of the campaign. The surge of support pushed their total just over $22,000, a substantial amount that reflected extraordinary community generosity, but still potentially insufficient against a corporate bidder with strategic business incentives. Elena took out a home equity line of credit as a final contingency, aware that it stretched their financial security to its limits, but unable to face the alternative of failing for want of preparation. The night before the auction, Elena sat with Maddie on the porch swing, gently rocking in the cool spring evening. Maddie held her father's dog tags, thumb tracing their embossed surface in a familiar, soothing pattern. "Tomorrow's a big day," Eleanor said softly, not expecting a response. "We're going to try our very best to bring Atlas home with us. I can't promise we'll win, Sweet Pea, but I promise we're going to try with everything we have." Maddie continued staring at the dog tags, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Then, in a movement that made Eleanor's breath catch, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. She handed it to her mother, eyes still fixed on the tags. Elena unfolded it to find a drawing, Maddie, herself and Atlas together on these same porch steps. "Our family," written across the top in Maddie's careful handwriting. It wasn't a question or even a statement. It was a declaration of how Maddie saw their future, with Atlas completing the family circle that Michael's death had broken. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, pulling her daughter close, "that's exactly right." As they sat together under the darkening sky, Elena allowed herself to hope, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Somewhere across town, Nathan Blackwood was likely reviewing auction strategies with his corporate team, prepared to invest whatever necessary to secure Atlas for his business interests. Tomorrow would determine whether their family would be made whole again or face yet another loss in a journey already marked by too much grief. What Elena didn't know, as she finally tucked Maddie into bed that night, was that Colonel Harrison sat in his office long after normal hours, reviewing a file that had been delivered to his desk that afternoon. Its contents would prove pivotal in ways none of them could anticipate when the gavel fell the following day. The Veterans Memorial Hall had never seen such a crowd for its annual benefit auction, typically attended by a modest gathering of military personnel, local businesses making charitable contributions, and a few dedicated supporters. Today, the parking lot overflowed with news vans from regional stations positioned near the entrance. Inside, the usual arrangement of folding chairs barely accommodated the diverse assembly. Military families in their Sunday best, handlers in uniform, local officials, and curious community members drawn by the story that had captured regional attention. At the front of the hall, a table displayed photographs of fallen service members alongside information about the Foundation's work supporting their families. To the side stood a podium where Major Patricia Dawkins, the designated auctioneer, reviewed her materials with military precision. The auction catalogue included standard items, vacation packages donated by supportive businesses, sports memorabilia signed by athlete veterans, handcrafted items from rehabilitation programs. But everyone knew the real draw was scheduled near the end. Elena arrived with Maddie and Rebecca 15 minutes before the start, their entrance causing a ripple of recognition through the crowd. Several attendees wore the small gold ribbons that had become shorthand for support of their cause. Colonel Harrison intercepted them near the door, his official demeanor softened slightly by the occasion. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, extending his hand professionally, "I wanted you to know that regardless of today's outcome, the base commander has authorized continued visitation privileges for Madison if," he glanced at Maddie, modifying his phrasing, "if circumstances require it." Eleanor nodded tightly, the backup plan feeling like cold comfort compared to what they were fighting for. "Thank you, Colonel, but we're here to bring Atlas home." Inside, they found seats near the front, saved by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and several other members of Michael's former unit who had arrived early to support them. Across the aisle, Nathan Blackwood sat with 3 associates, their tailored suits and confident postures contrasting with the more casual attire of most attendees. Blackwood nodded cordially toward Elena, his expression revealing nothing of his intentions. Maddie, wearing a blue dress Elena recognized as the one she'd chosen for her father's memorial service, clutched her wooden donation box tightly. Inside wasn't just her personal savings, but small contributions from classmates. Quarters, dimes, even pennies, offered with children's solemn assurances that this will help get your doggy back. The weight of their collective hope felt heavier than the actual coins. At precisely 1100 hours, Major Dawkins called the room to attention, welcoming attendees and explaining the auction's purpose with brisk efficiency. The standard items proceeded. As expected, polite bidding, respectful applause, steady accumulation of funds for the Foundation's programs. Elena barely registered these preliminaries, her attention divided between the tightness in her chest and Maddie's rigid posture beside her. An unexpected murmur swept through the crowd as a side door opened and Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh appeared, leading Atlas on a leash. The Belgian Malinois moved with the disciplined grace of his training, though Eleanor immediately noticed changes since their last visit. Atlas had lost weight, his muscular frame slightly leaner than optimal. More concerning was the grey beginning to show around his muzzle. Not unusual for a working dog of his age, but somehow more pronounced than she remembered. The moment Atlas spotted Maddie, the transformation was unmistakable. His alert posture intensified, ears forward, gaze locked on the small figure in the blue dress. When Walsh attempted a subtle correction to maintain protocol, Atlas complied without breaking. His focus on Maddie, the connection between them, visible to everyone present, created an emotional undercurrent that transcended the formal proceedings. Finally, after what felt like hours, Major Dawkins announced, "Next item, ladies and gentlemen, is the retirement. Placement of military working dog Atlas, a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois with distinguished service to our nation." She continued with a detailed listing of Atlas's credentials, training value, and service record as Walsh led him to the stage area. MWD Atlas has received specialized training valued at approximately $35,000, including explosive detection, patrol operations, and tactical service. He has been awarded the K9 Service Medal for his actions during Operation Northern Resolve, where he and his handler were instrumental in saving their unit from an ambush. Elena noticed Maddie's small fingers tighten around her donation box at the mention of the operation where Michael had lost his life. Across the aisle, Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening as the bidding prepared to open. Due to age and recent medical evaluation, MWD Atlas is being retired from active service, Major Dawkins continued. As per Military Working Dog Foundation protocol, he's being offered for placement through charitable auction, with proceeds benefiting support programs for families of fallen service members. Walsh commanded Atlas to sit at attention under the bright lights. The Malinois' coat gleamed, his alert posture demonstrating the valuable training referenced in the auctioneer's introduction. Despite his perfect form, his attention repeatedly shifted to Maddie, brief glances that any handler would recognize as divided focus. Extraordinary for a dog trained to maintain absolute attention on command. "We'll open the bidding at $5,000, Major Dawkins announced. "Do I hear $5,000? Elena raised her numbered paddle immediately. Several other paddles rose as well, including Blackwood's, creating an initial flurry of activity that moved swiftly upward. "I have 5,000, now 6,000, 6,000 from number 42, now 7,000. Maddie opened her donation box as the figures climbed, carefully counting out coins and small bills on her lap. The poignancy of this action, a child counting pennies while adults bid thousands, was not lost on the crowd, especially when a photographer captured the moment for what would become the next day's front-page image. At $10,000, most casual bidders dropped out, leaving Eleanor and Blackwood in direct competition. Rebecca placed a supportive hand on Elena's shoulder as she raised their paddle for $11,000. Blackwood immediately countered with $12,000. "I have $12,000 from number 16 looking for $13,000, Major Dawkins called, her practiced gaze sweeping the room. Elena hesitated momentarily, mentally calculating their resources. Their GoFundMe had reached $22,680 after the final surge of support, and with the home equity line, they could go to $35,000 if absolutely necessary, though that would leave them financially vulnerable for years to come. She raised her paddle. $13,000. Blackwood didn't hesitate. $15,000. On stage, Atlas had maintained perfect sit-stay position, but his attention had fixed increasingly on Maddie as the bidding escalated. A low whine escaped him, subtle enough that only Walsh noticed, placing a calming hand on the dog's head. The bidding continued its upward trajectory, each increase causing Elena's heart to sink further, despite her determination to show no weakness. At $20,000, she felt Rebecca's hand tighten on her shoulder, a silent question about their limits. They had discussed this extensively, calculating exactly how far they could reasonably stretch before endangering their basic financial security. $21,000, Elena called, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. $25,000, Blackwood countered, his associate leaning in to whisper something that he dismissed with a small gesture. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. The previous record for any auction item at the benefit had been $18,000 for a vacation package donated by a luxury resort. The current bidding for a single military working dog with limited service years remaining had transcended all reasonable valuation. Throughout this escalation, Maddie had continued methodically counting her savings, oblivious to the adult machinations around her. She had arranged $43.27 in coins and small bills beside her on the seat, finally looking up to tug at her mother's sleeve. Elena leaned down, straining to hear what might be a rare public communication. Maddie's lips moved, but no audible sound emerged. Frustrated, she pointed urgently to her money, then to Atlas, her meaning clear, even without words. She wanted to add her savings to their bid. The moment crystallized the emotional core of the event in a way no adult arguments about policy or liability could match. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she nodded to Maddie, then raised her paddle again. "I have $25,000 from number 16, Major Dawkins noted. Number 37, are you bidding again?" Elena stood, her voice steady despite the emotion constricting her throat. "My daughter would like to add $43.27 to our previous bid. That's every penny she has saved since she was 6 years old, plus donations from her classmates." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood beside Elena and Maddie, his earlier reservations visibly replaced by protective determination. Major Dawkins, a veteran of countless military ceremonies, found herself momentarily speechless. Recovering, she said, "I have a bid of $21,043.27 from the Sullivan family." The technical inadequacy of this figure against Blackwood's current high bid of $25,000 was obvious to everyone. What happened next would be recounted throughout the military community for months to come. Nathan Blackwood rose to his feet. $30,000, he stated, his voice carrying an edge of finality directed at Elena. At that moment, a commotion from the stage drew all attention. Atlas, breaking his perfect sit-stay for the first time in the memory of any handler present, had stood alert, eyes fixed on Maddie. When Walsh attempted to re-establish control with a subtle correction, Atlas resisted, not aggressively, but with the immovable determination that made Belgian Malinois legendary as working dogs. The sudden tension transmitted itself to Walsh, who recognized something significant was happening. Rather than force compliance, he allowed the dog a controlled movement forward to the edge of the stage, where Atlas's focus on Maddie intensified. In that charged moment, Maddie slipped from her mother's grasp and stepped into the center aisle. Elena reached for her, but Rebecca gently held her back, intuiting that something crucial was unfolding. Standing alone in the aisle, Maddie reached for the dog tags around her neck, Her father's identification, his service number still visible despite years of being held in small fingers. She raised them toward Atlas, a gesture reminiscent of how Michael might have displayed his identification during operations. The room fell silent as Walsh, responding to a handler's instinct honed through years of canine work, made a split-second decision. He unclipped Atlas's leash, giving the dog freedom, while maintaining a hand signal that communicated controlled release rather than free movement. Atlas stepped carefully from the stage and approached Maddie with the measured pace of a working dog on assignment. He stopped precisely 2 feet from her, the exact distance military working dogs were trained to maintain when guarding a protected individual. Maddie's lips moved, nothing audible reaching the stunned audience. But Atlas's ears twitched forward. In response, she spoke again, and this time, though still barely above a whisper, her words carried in the absolute silence of the room. Guardian position. It was one of her father's training commands, words Michael had used hundreds of times. During Atlas's development as a military working dog, the dog's response was immediate. He settled into a perfect protective stance beside her, attentive and prepared. Maddie turned to face the audience, her small face showing determination that belied her years. When she spoke again, her voice gained strength with each word, rusty from disuse but increasingly clear. My daddy said Atlas is not just a dog, he's a soldier. Her hand touched the dog tags at her neck. Like this, it means he protects people who need him. She looked back at Atlas, then directly at Major Dawkins. I need him. The simplicity and clarity of this statement, coming from a child who had not spoken publicly in 18 months, created an almost physical impact in the room. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming unchecked. Rebecca stood motionless, witnessing the breakthrough they had all but abandoned hope for. Major Dawkins, a mother herself, cleared her throat repeatedly before finding her voice. Young lady, are you bidding on this MWD? Maddie nodded solemnly. Everything I have, she said, gesturing to her carefully counted savings. Before the auctioneer could respond to this unprecedented situation, Colonel Harrison stood, moving to the front of the room with measured military bearing. He had remained silent throughout the proceedings, observing from an official capacity rather than participating. Now he addressed the room with the authority of his rank. As the authorized representative of the base commander, I am exercising emergency discretionary authority regarding MWD Atlas. He produced an official folder from his uniform jacket, opening it to remove a document bearing military seals. New information relevant to this placement has been received and verified within the last 24 hours. Captain Michael Sullivan's final mission report, previously classified due to operational security concerns, has been cleared for limited disclosure. A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd as Harrison continued. This document confirms that MWD Atlas directly saved 3 additional service members during the operation that claimed Captain Sullivan's life, sustaining injuries while maintaining position over his handler's body until extraction teams arrived approximately 40 minutes later. The clinical description couldn't mask the emotional weight of the revelation. Atlas had not just been present during Michael's final moments, but had protected him and others with extraordinary devotion. Under Military Working Dog Foundation Guidelines, Section 8, Paragraph 3, Harrison continued, dogs who demonstrate exceptional loyalty and service beyond standard duty requirements may be designated for handler family placement upon retirement, superseding standard auction protocol. He turned to face Elena directly. Mrs. Sullivan, the United States Army formally recognizes MWD Atlas's exceptional service and hereby offers permanent placement with your family, subject only to completion of standard handler transition training and home environment certification. The proclamation was met with a moment of stunned silence before spontaneous applause erupted, quickly swelling to fill the room. Walsh approached Maddie officially, presenting Atlas's leash to her with the formal handover used when canines transferred between handlers. MWD Atlas, new handler, he stated, following protocol, despite the unconventional circumstances. Maddie accepted the leash with the same solemnity, then broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in years as Atlas pressed closer, maintaining his protective position beside her. Nathan Blackwood, who had watched the proceedings with increasingly evident frustration, approached Colonel Harrison as the crowd surrounded the Sullivan family. "Colonel, while this makes for a touching scene, I must object to this procedural irregularity. My company has invested considerable time and resources based on the published auction protocol. This last-minute policy exception is fully documented and authorized," Harrison interrupted, his tone making it clear the matter was not open for discussion. The classification status of the mission report was the only reason this exception wasn't applied from the beginning. He met Blackwood's gaze directly. "The Foundation appreciates your interest in supporting veterans' families, Mr. Blackwood. I'm sure your generous donation will still be welcomed, even without acquiring the dog." Blackwood studied Harrison for a long moment, recognizing the immovable position of military authority when he encountered it. With a tight nod of concession, he turned to leave, pausing only briefly near Elena. "Congratulations, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his professional mask firmly in place despite his evident disappointment. "I hope you understand exactly what you're taking responsibility for." Elena met his gaze directly. "Better than you might think, Mr. Blackwood. My husband made sure of that." As administrative details were handled by the officials, Maddie knelt beside Atlas, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder in a gesture uncannily similar to how her father had often positioned himself. With his canine partner, Walsh observed with professional interest as she whispered something that caused the Malinois' ears to prick forward attentively. "What did she say to him?" Walsh asked Elena quietly. Elena watched her daughter, bittersweet joy filling her chest. "The same thing Michael always told him at the end of a mission: we're going home now." The initial elation that swept through the Veterans Memorial Hall began to temper as practical realities asserted themselves in the aftermath of the unprecedented auction. Maddie stood quietly beside Atlas, her small hand clutching his leash with newfound confidence. The adults surrounding them dissolved into discussion of logistics, transportation arrangements, necessary supplies, training schedules. Colonel Harrison, despite his authoritative intervention, pulled Walsh aside for a consultation that, though conducted in professional undertones, carried unmistakable tension. "The placement is approved, but the transition protocol must be followed to the letter," Harrison insisted, gesturing toward the documentation folder. "Regardless of the emotional circumstances, a fully trained military working dog requires proper decommissioning procedures and handler certification for the receiving party." His gaze shifted meaningfully toward Elena, who was accepting congratulations from Michael's former unit members. "Mrs. Sullivan will need to complete the full handler training program, including scenario testing and command verification." "There can be no shortcuts on this, Sergeant." Walsh nodded his understanding. "I'll personally oversee the transition, sir. Captain Sullivan was my training officer. I owe him that much." As they finalized arrangements for Atlas's formal release from military service, Elena found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many offering practical assistance along with congratulations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez handed her a card with contact information for the base veterinarian who had overseen Atlas's care. "He knows Atlas's medical history better than anyone," Rodriguez explained. "The hip injury from last year hasn't affected his mobility, but he'll need regular monitoring as he ages." Another handler provided information about specialized food suppliers, while a military family who had previously adopted a retired working dog offered tips about helping Atlas adjust. to civilian home life. The first few weeks are the most challenging, the handler's wife advised. Their whole routine changes. No more kennels, different sounds, household patterns they're not used to. Be patient and maintain as much structure as possible. Throughout these conversations, Elena found herself continually glancing toward Maddie, still absorbing the miracle of hearing her daughter's voice after so many months of silence. Maddie remained focused on Atlas, occasionally whispering words only the dog could hear. Her body language transformed from its habitual rigidity to something approaching normal childhood animation. Dr. Bennett, who had arrived late after seeing the story developing on local news, observed the interaction with professional assessment overlaid with genuine emotion. "This is remarkable progress," she told Elena quietly, "but prepare for an adjustment period. Trauma recovery isn't linear. There may be setbacks alongside breakthroughs. The important thing is that she's found a secure attachment point that's helping her process her grief actively rather than through withdrawal." As the crowd gradually dispersed and administrative details were completed, the Sullivan family finally prepared to leave with their newest member. Atlas, who had maintained perfect behavior throughout the lengthy proceedings, showed his first signs of stress, minor restlessness that any handler would recognize as the limit of trained endurance being approached. Walsh noticed immediately. "He's been on duty stance for almost 3 hours, he explained to Elena. "Even the best trained dogs have limits to their formal positioning time. He needs release and appropriate exercise before transitioning to your home environment." Understanding dawned on Elena. This wasn't just about taking a dog home, it was about responsibly transitioning a highly trained military asset to civilian life. The full weight of what they were undertaking suddenly felt overwhelming despite all her preparation. Walsh, recognizing her momentary uncertainty, offered the first practical solution. "There's a secure training field behind the hall. Why don't we start the transition there? Atlas needs to understand that taking commands from you doesn't diminish his training. It extends it to a new handler." The suggestion provided exactly the structured beginning they needed. While Rebecca took Maddie to the restroom, Walsh led Eleanor to the training field, Atlas moving obediently between them. "The foundation requires a minimum 2-week handler transition," Walsh explained as they entered the fenced area. "Normally, that would happen on base, but given the circumstances, we can modify the protocol to conduct sessions at your home, provided we document proper progression." He handed Elena a specialized training lead. "Show me what you know. Captain Sullivan must have worked with you somewhat during home periods." Elena took a deep breath, mentally reviewing everything she had studied from Michael's journals. She adjusted her posture the way Michael had always demonstrated, pitched her voice in the clear, confident tone working dogs responded to, and gave the first basic command. "Atlas, heel." The Malinois responded immediately, moving into perfect position at her left side. The simple success bolstered her confidence as she proceeded through basic positioning commands, sit, stay, down, come, that Michael had occasionally allowed her to practice during his home rotations, Walsh observed with professional assessment. "Good foundation." His response is immediate. He already recognizes you as part of his handler family structure. He adjusted Elena's hand position slightly. "Keep your signals consistent with his training. Military working dogs are taught to respond to precise commands. Variation creates confusion." For the next 30 minutes, they worked through progressively. More complex commands, Walsh providing guidance while allowing Elena to establish her own handling relationship with Atlas. By the time Maddie and Rebecca rejoined them, Elena had progressed to recall commands from increasing distances, Atlas returning to her with the same focused intensity he had shown with Michael. Maddie watched with solemn attention, her re-emergence into verbal communication still tentative, but strengthening with each interaction. When Walsh suggested she might try a basic command under supervision, her face showed both eagerness and apprehension. "Remember how Daddy did it?" Elena encouraged gently. Maddie nodded, squaring her small shoulders and assuming a posture that mimicked her father's with unconscious accuracy. "Atlas, come!" The dog, who had been in a stay position near Walsh, immediately responded, moving to Maddie with perfect attention. The success brought a smile that transformed her face, erasing months of withdrawn affect in an instant of genuine connection. "He remembers me," she whispered, looking up at her mother with wonder. "Of course he does," Elena affirmed, the simple truth containing layers of meaning for all of them. As the afternoon light began to fade, they finally loaded Atlas into their SUV for the journey home. Walsh provided a transitional kit, Atlas's military gear, medical records, specialized food, and training equipment, along with a schedule for the handler certification sessions Elena would need to complete over the coming weeks. "This is just the beginning," he reminded them. "A proper transition takes time and consistent work. Atlas has been a working dog his entire life. Retirement doesn't mean he stops needing structure and purpose." Eleanor nodded her understanding. "We'll continue his training daily. Michael's records include all his protocols. We'll maintain as much consistency as possible." As they drove away from the Veterans Memorial Hall, Elena watched in the rearview mirror as Maddie sat beside Atlas. In the back seat, one small hand resting on his fur, her lips occasionally moving in what appeared to be quiet conversation with the dog. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges. Financial adjustments, training requirements, the inevitable complications of integrating a highly trained military working dog into civilian life. But in this moment, the simple sight of her daughter communicating again outweighed all future concerns. Rebecca, following her gaze, smiled with cautious optimism. "One day at a time," she said softly, echoing the mantra that had carried them through the darkest periods after Michael's death. "One day at a time," Elena agreed, turning onto the highway that would carry them home, a home that now felt one step closer to healing than it had when they left that morning. Atlas entered the Sullivan home with the cautious precision of a soldier conducting reconnaissance in unfamiliar territory. His alert posture and methodical movement through each room revealed his training, systematically checking corners, doorways, and windows in a security assessment pattern ingrained through years of military service. Maddie followed close behind, watching with fascination as the Malinois mapped his new environment with all senses engaged. Eleanor observed this careful inspection, recognizing behaviors Michael had explained during the dog's previous homestays between deployments. Those visits had been different. Atlas had been on official leave, but still an active military working dog, with Michael maintaining his training regimen and handler relationship. Now, the transition represented something far more significant. Atlas was retiring from military service and becoming permanently integrated into their family structure. "He's checking all the exit points," Elena explained to Maddie as Atlas paused at the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. "Dad taught him to always know how to get out of a building in an emergency." Maddie nodded, her earlier verbal breakthrough at the auction having evolved into occasional short phrases rather than complete silence, though she still spoke more readily to Atlas than to people. "He's being careful," she observed quietly. Rebecca, who had been setting up the specialized feeding station included in Atlas's transition kit, joined them in observing his methodical exploration. "Should we let him into the backyard to check the perimeter?" she asked, using the terminology Walsh had employed during their pre-departure briefing. Elena nodded, referring to the handler notes she'd been reviewing. "Yes, but with the training lead attached for this first inspection, Walsh said maintaining control protocols during initial environmental introduction helps establish proper boundaries." She retrieved the special lead from Atlas's equipment bag and approached him with the confident posture she'd practiced. "Atlas, heel." The command, delivered in the clear, consistent tone Michael had used, brought the dog immediately to position beside her left leg. Maddie watched with evident pride as her mother worked through the proper leashing procedure, attaching the lead to Atlas's tactical collar with precise movements that respected his training, while establishing her authority as his new handler. "Ready to see your new yard?" Elena asked Atlas, maintaining the conversational tone Michael had always used alongside formal commands. A technique his journal explained helped working dogs distinguish between duty and relaxation periods, while strengthening handler bonds. They moved through the sliding door as a unit, Atlas maintaining perfect heel position until given permission to inspect the fenced backyard. Elena released him with the command, "Search perimeter," one of the specialized instructions Walsh had confirmed Atlas was trained to understand. What followed was a textbook demonstration of military working dog methodology. Atlas systematically moving along the fence line, investigating potential access points, scent checking for any previous animal visitors, and establishing a mental map of his new territory. The precision of his movement reflected years of tactical training now being applied to a civilian context. "He's making sure it's safe," Maddie explained to Rebecca, unconsciously echoing phrases she must have heard from her father. That's his job. When Atlas completed his inspection, he returned directly to Elena, indicating completion of the assigned task with the alert posture Michael had documented in his training journals. The small family moment, a dog returning from a yard inspection, carried deeper significance for all of them. This wasn't just a pet exploring a new home. This was the beginning of rebuilding their family structure with Atlas as an integral member. That first evening established patterns that would guide their transition over the coming weeks. Elena carefully followed the feeding protocols outlined in Atlas's military records. Specific portions measured precisely, served at the exact time indicated in his previous schedule. The routine wasn't merely about nutrition, but about maintaining continuity for a dog whose entire life had been structured around military precision. Bedtime presented the first significant challenge. Atlas had spent his entire life either in military kennels or during home rotations with Michael in a specialized crate in the home office that provided secure containment while satisfying his training requirements. Now, the question of where he would sleep required balancing his established patterns against their desire to integrate him fully into family life. "What do you think, Sweet Pea?" Eleanor asked Maddie as they prepared for bed. "Should Atlas sleep in his crate in the office like he did when Dad was home? Or would you like him somewhere else?" Maddie, dressed in pajamas featuring cartoon dogs, that suddenly seemed childishly inappropriate, given the real military working dog, now standing attentively nearby, considered the question with serious deliberation. "Atlas protected Daddy," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "Now he needs to protect us." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Elena was still processing as she helped Maddie arrange a specialized dog bed beside her daughter's bed, positioning it according to the tactical placement Michael had documented for security sleeping arrangements during deployed operations. Between the door and the human being protected, providing optimal response positioning in case of threat. Atlas settled onto the bed after thorough inspection, his posture alert even in rest, eyes tracking both Maddie and the bedroom door in the vigilant awareness that never fully deactivated in properly trained working dogs. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions, watching him assume his protective position. Gratitude for his presence, sorrow for the circumstances that had brought him permanently into their home, and a renewed awareness of Michael's absence in this moment that should have been shared. "Good night, Sweet Pea," she said, kissing Maddie's forehead. "I'll be right across the hall if you need anything." Maddie nodded, already looking more relaxed than she had in months. "Atlas will get me if I need help," she replied with absolute confidence. "That's what Dad taught him." Later, Lying awake, in the darkness of her own room, Elena reviewed the day's events with lingering disbelief. The morning had begun with desperate hope and limited expectations. It had ended with Atlas officially part of their family and Maddie speaking again, albeit in measured phrases rather than her previous animated chatter. The magnitude of these changes left Elena simultaneously exhausted and too wired to sleep, her mind cycling through practical concerns about the responsibilities they had assumed. Their financial situation remained precarious despite avoiding the auction payment. The GoFundMe funds would now cover Atlas's specialized care, the structural modifications Walsh had recommended for their home, and the equipment necessary for proper handling, expenses that would strain their budget but no longer threatened. Financial catastrophe. Still, Eleanor made mental calculations of adjustments they would need to implement, from increased pet insurance coverage to accommodating the handler certification schedule alongside her nursing shifts. A soft sound from Maddie's room interrupted these thoughts. Elena rose immediately, maternal instinct overriding fatigue as she moved to check on her daughter. Pausing at the partially open bedroom door, she witnessed a scene that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Maddie, who had suffered from nightmares since Michael's death, appeared to be experiencing another episode. Small whimpers and restless movements signaling the onset of the terror that typically escalated into screaming episodes that left her daughter exhausted and even more withdrawn. Before Elena could intervene, Atlas rose from his bed and moved to position himself closer, resting his head gently on the edge of Maddie's mattress. The physical proximity had an immediate effect. Maddie's distress signals subsided as she unconsciously registered the dog's presence. Without fully waking, she turned toward him, one hand coming to rest on his fur. Atlas remained perfectly still, maintaining the contact that provided comfort while staying vigilant in his protective role. Elena watched, understanding washing over her in a powerful wave. This was why Michael had believed so strongly in the unique bond between handlers and their dogs, the intuitive understanding that transcended training and entered the realm of genuine connection. Atlas had recognized Maddie's distress and responded with exactly the intervention needed, neither overreacting nor ignoring the subtle signs of her discomfort. Returning to her room, Eleanor retrieved Michael's journal from her bedside table, turning to a passage she had read repeatedly during their preparation. A working dog's greatest value isn't in the tasks they perform, but in their capacity to understand human needs beyond verbal communication. Atlas recognizes emotional states in our unit members before they vocalize them: stress, fear, hesitation. This isn't merely training, it's an evolved empathic response that makes these animals extraordinary partners rather than simply tactical assets. The words, written in Michael's distinctive handwriting, felt like a message across time, reassurance that their decision to bring Atlas home wasn't simply emotional indulgence, but recognition of the genuine therapeutic relationship the dog provided for Maddie's recovery. The following morning established the beginning of their new routine. Elena woke at 0500, military time now consciously adopted to maintain Atlas's schedule, and found the Malinois already alert, standing at Maddie's bedroom door in the characteristic ready posture documented in Michael's handling guides. His internal clock, conditioned through years of military service, functioned with precision that required no alarm. "Good morning, Atlas," she greeted him softly, receiving an attentive ear twitch in response. "Ready for morning PT?" The abbreviated term for physical training, one of many military expressions that had entered their household vocabulary through Michael, triggered immediate recognition. Atlas moved to heel position, awaiting the outdoor exercise that had been part of his daily routine throughout his service career. In the backyard, as dawn light gradually illuminated their neighborhood, Eleanor worked through the exercise protocol, Walsh had provided a combination of obedience drills, controlled running patterns, and training reinforcement designed to maintain Atlas's physical conditioning while strengthening their handler bond. The routine, initially awkward as she navigated commands that felt foreign on her tongue, gradually became smoother as Atlas responded with increasing recognition of her as his new handler. Maddie appeared in the doorway midway through the session, watching with sleep-tousled hair and an expression of solemn interest. Without prompting, she moved to the precise position Michael had taught her years earlier, the designated family observation spot, where she could watch training without creating distraction. When Elena completed the final drill sequence, she turned to find Maddie standing straighter than she had in months, her small face showing determination mingled with lingering sleep. "Can I try?" she asked, the request reflecting both childhood desire and something deeper, a need to connect actively with this link to her father. Elena hesitated momentarily, remembering Walsh's caution about maintaining clear handler hierarchy during the transition period. But Michael's journals had emphasized the importance of family integration in working dog retirement, with carefully supervised participation building positive associations with civilian life. "Just the basic commands we practiced yesterday," Elena agreed, handing Maddie the short training lead. "Remember how Dad showed you? Clear voice, confident posture." The impromptu training session that followed revealed how much Maddie had absorbed from observing her father work with Atlas over the years. Though her commands lacked adult authority, she replicated Michael's hand positions and vocal patterns with surprising accuracy, clearly drawing on memories of countless backyard training sessions she had witnessed. Atlas responded with professional attention, adjusting his compliance to match her capabilities, moving precisely but at a gentler pace, maintaining attentive focus while accommodating her less confident delivery. This calibration, Walsh had explained, was the hallmark of exceptional working dogs, the ability to recognize handler differences and adapt accordingly while maintaining training integrity. By the time Rebecca joined them, bearing coffee for Elena and breakfast preparations underway, a subtle shift had already occurred in their family dynamic. The shared activity had created a moment of normalcy none of them had experienced since Michael's death, a structured interaction centered around Atlas that provided context for their new reality. The remainder of their first full day with Atlas involved practical integration steps that Walsh had outlined. Elena methodically introduced Atlas to each area of their home, establishing clear boundaries about where he was permitted and which spaces remained off-limits. The Malinois absorbed these guidelines with the focused attention that had made him an exceptional military asset, requiring minimal repetition to understand expectations. Rebecca, initially hesitant about having a combat-trained military dog in their home, found her concerns easing as she observed Atlas's disciplined behavior and responsive intelligence. "He's nothing like I expected," she admitted, watching the Malinois inspect his designated resting place in the living room. "I thought he'd be more intimidating." "That's because he's not in working mode," Elena explained, referencing what she'd learned from Michael's journals. Military working dogs are trained to differentiate between operational and home environments. Right now, he's responding to all the cues that signal he's in family mode, not tactical deployment. The distinction became clearly evident later that afternoon when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Atlas, who had been resting near Maddie as she worked on a drawing, transformed instantly, his relaxed posture replaced by alert readiness, positioning himself between the family and the potential threat with silent, focused intensity that demonstrated his protective training. Elena, recognizing the security response described in Michael's handling notes, immediately implemented the proper protocol. "Atlas, stand down," she commanded firmly, using the specific phrase that indicated she was assuming assessment of the situation. Family approved. The Malinois immediately moderated his alert stance, though he maintained vigilant attention as Elena checked the security camera they had installed after Michael's death. The visitor was Kelly Thompson, a neighbor whose son attended school with Maddie, arriving to drop off homework assignments Maddie had missed during her recent absences. "Wait until I signal," Elena instructed Maddie and Rebecca, approaching the door with Atlas in controlled heel position. The formal introduction procedure Walsh had emphasized for all new visitors would become routine over the coming weeks. But this first implementation carried particular significance in establishing proper integration patterns. Kelly's expression registered surprise tinged with apprehension at the sight of the Belgian Malinois standing attentively beside Eleanor. "Oh, you actually got him. I saw something on the news, but I wasn't sure." "Yes, Atlas is officially part of our family now," Elena confirmed, maintaining the calm, confident demeanor essential for proper working dog handling during introductions. "He's perfectly safe, but we need to follow introduction protocols while he adjusts to civilian life. Would you like to meet him properly?" The careful introduction that followed, allowing Atlas to inspect Kelly under supervision, establishing her as an approved visitor through specific commands, demonstrated the structured approach that would characterize their transition. Kelly's initial nervousness gave way to cautious appreciation as she observed the Malinois' disciplined behavior and evident intelligence. "He's so different from what I imagined," she commented, echoing Rebecca's earlier observation, as Atlas maintained a perfect downstay throughout their conversation. "You always hear about military dogs being these intense attack animals, but he's so controlled." "That's exactly what made him exceptional at his job," Elena explained, feeling a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. "The best military working dogs aren't aggressive, they're disciplined. Atlas was trained to respond proportionally to threats, not to react indiscriminately." As Kelly prepared to leave, she hesitated before asking the question that likely represented what many in their community wondered. "Is it really safe, though? Having a dog trained for combat around Maddie? I mean, after everything she's been through." The question contained genuine concern rather than judgment, prompting Elena to answer thoughtfully rather than defensively. Atlas was specifically trained to protect Michael's unit, including in environments with civilians present. That training included precise threat discrimination and proportional response. He recognizes Maddie as someone to be protected, not as a threat. She glanced toward the living room, where Maddie had resumed her drawing with Atlas now positioned. Beside her, his alert attention divided between monitoring the front entrance and maintaining proximity to his primary charge. "More importantly," Elena continued, "he's the first thing that's helped her begin speaking again. Whatever challenges come with integrating him into our home, that alone makes them worthwhile." After Kelly's departure, the evening settled into what would become their new normal. Dinner prepared according to the schedule Atlas was accustomed to, evening activities adjusted to accommodate his security checks and final exercise requirements, bedtime routines that incorporated his protective positioning. Each element required conscious attention to detail that Elena knew would eventually become second nature, but initially demanded their focused effort. As she completed Atlas's evening health check, a protocol Michael had documented meticulously, in his handling journals, Elena found herself speaking aloud to the attentive Malinois. "You're doing great with all these changes," she told him, examining his previously injured hip with gentle assessment. "I know this isn't what either of us expected, but we're figuring it out together." Atlas maintained steady eye contact, his intelligent gaze seeming to convey understanding beyond what could be attributed to mere animal cognition. In that moment, Elena felt the full weight of the responsibility they had assumed, alongside the profound gift Atlas's presence represented. Later, completing her nightly check on Maddie before retiring, Elena paused in the doorway of her daughter's room. Maddie lay sleeping peacefully, one arm extended toward Atlas, who maintained his protective position beside her bed. The Malinois acknowledged Elena's presence with a subtle ear movement, but did not shift from his vigilant posture. "Good boy," she whispered, the simple praise containing volumes of gratitude. "Good boy, Atlas." The dog's ears twitched in recognition, but his primary focus remained unwavering, protecting the child who now represented his purpose in this new chapter of his life. In that quiet moment, Elena felt Michael's presence more tangibly than at any point since his death, not as absence or loss, but as continuation through the bond he had forged with Atlas that now extended to their daughter. The path ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges. Tomorrow would bring the first of Elena's formal handler certification sessions, medical appointments to establish Atlas's civilian veterinary care, and continued adjustments to their home environment based on Walsh's recommendations. But tonight, watching her daughter sleep peacefully under Atlas's protection, Elena allowed herself to recognize the first fragile emergence of hope in what had been an 18-month journey through grief's darkest territories. They weren't simply adopting a dog. They were rebuilding their family around the living legacy Michael had left them, a legacy embodied in 90 pounds of disciplined intelligence and unwavering loyalty, now standing guard beside their daughter's bed. Part 5. Echoes of Service. The unopened letter from Colonel Harrison sat on the kitchen counter like an undetonated possibility, its official envelope catching the morning light. Eleanor Sullivan noticed it again as she packed Maddie's lunch, her movements automatic after years of carefully orchestrated routines. Atlas watched from his position near the kitchen doorway, his amber eyes tracking her with the same vigilant attention he had maintained since becoming part of their family. 3 years had transformed their household. Maddie, now 11, bore little resemblance to the silent, grief-stricken child who had fought so desperately to keep Atlas at the auction. Her hair, once limp and dull with emotional weight, now fell in confident waves around her shoulders. She moved with a purpose that would have been unimaginable just years earlier, Atlas moving in perfect synchronization beside her. "Mom, I need the blue folder with my science project," Maddie called from her bedroom. Atlas was already in motion before Elena could respond, padding down the hallway to retrieve the exact item Maddie needed. The dog's ability to anticipate needs had become so seamless that it hardly registered as remarkable anymore. When Eleanor finally opened the letter during her lunch break at the hospital, the contents both surprised and intrigued her. Colonel Harrison requested a meeting, not at the base, but at a local coffee shop near the VA hospital. The cryptic nature of the request felt deliberate, carrying an urgency that made her pulse quicken. Her nursing shift that day was unusually challenging. A new patient, Michael Johnston, had been admitted with complex injuries that spoke of multiple deployments. His medical chart read like a catalogue of military sacrifice, traumatic brain injury, multiple orthopedic traumas, and psychological markers that suggested deep, unresolved trauma. Elena recognized the signs. She had seen them before, in soldiers who had given everything and found themselves struggling to reclaim even the most basic elements of civilian life. As she reviewed his chart, a photograph fell from between the pages. A Belgian Malinois, younger but with the same alert posture as Atlas, stood beside Johnston in what appeared to be a forward operating base. The dog's eyes held a familiar intensity, the look of a working dog fully connected to its handler. That Evening, Elena found herself studying the photograph more closely. The dog in the image was clearly no longer active service, slight greying around the muzzle, a certain softness in the stance that spoke of retirement. Yet something about the image tugged at her awareness. Maddie noticed her mother's distraction during dinner. "You're thinking about something," she observed, Atlas's head immediately lifting from his position beside her chair. The dog's protective instincts remained sharp, always attuned to any shift in the family's emotional landscape. "I have a meeting with Colonel Harrison tomorrow," Elena explained. "Something about a special request. The meeting was scheduled for 700 hours. Military time still peppered their language, a remnant of Michael's influence. Colonel Harrison arrived precisely on time, his military bearing softened by years of compassionate service. He carried a thick manila folder, its edges worn and marked with official stamps. "The Johnston case," Harrison began without preamble, "requires a unique intervention." Michael Johnston's story unfolded like a complex tactical operation. A K-9 handler who had lost his working dog during a critical mission in Afghanistan, Johnston had been struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Traditional therapy had failed. Rehabilitation programs had reached their limits. "We believe Atlas might be the key to his recovery," Harrison said, watching Elena's reaction carefully. The proposal was unprecedented. Not a simple therapy dog, intervention, but a carefully structured rehabilitation approach that would leverage Atlas's unique training and the Sullivan family's demonstrated ability to support working dogs transitioning to civilian life. Atlas, who had been lying quietly nearby, suddenly raised his head. His ears pricked forward with an alertness that suggested he was listening, truly listening to the conversation. Maddie's school was experiencing its own challenges. Jason Miller, a new student, carried a weight of isolation that reminded her of her own early struggles. Unlike Maddie, who had found healing through Atlas, Jason seemed trapped in a silent world of his own making. During lunch, Maddie approached him. Atlas, always nearby but carefully trained to provide space when needed, watched from a respectful distance. "My dad was a soldier too," she said simply, sliding her lunch tray next to Jason's. The boy looked up, something in her voice cutting through his defensive wall. At the VA hospital, Elena began preparing for Johnston's specialized rehabilitation. Her nursing background, combined with the insights she'd gained from Michael's journals about working dog psychology, gave her a unique perspective on trauma recovery. Johnston's medical team was skeptical. Controlled therapy dog interactions had proven minimally effective. But this was different. A potential deep neurological reconnection facilitated by a dog who understood the specific language of military service. Colonel Harrison had done his homework. Atlas's medical and psychological evaluations, his demonstrated ability to support trauma recovery, made him an ideal candidate for this experimental intervention. The pieces were assembling themselves. Johnston's need for connection, Atlas's unique capabilities, the Sullivan family's understanding of military working dog psychology. What had begun as a potentially routine meeting was transforming into something far more significant. On the drive home, Elena noticed Atlas watching her with an intensity that suggested he understood more than a typical dog would. Michael had always maintained that working dogs comprehended far more than most people realized. Now, Elena was beginning to truly understand what he meant. Maddie's conversation with Jason had revealed more than she initially realized. Jason's father had been killed in a training accident, leaving the boy disconnected from a world that seemed indifferent to his loss. In Maddie, he found someone who understood the complex geography of grief. As night fell, the Sullivan household settled into its familiar rhythm. Atlas completed his evening security check, a habit ingrained through Years of military training. Elena reviewed the notes for Johnston's potential rehabilitation. Maddie worked on a school project, occasionally whispering instructions to Atlas, who remained her silent collaborator. The letter from Colonel Harrison, now opened and studied multiple times, represented more than a simple request. It was an invitation to heal, to serve, to continue a legacy of connection that transcended traditional boundaries of family, service, and recovery. Something significant was taking shape, and Atlas, as always, was at the center of it all. The VA Rehabilitation Center occupied a converted military facility on the outskirts of town, its brick walls bearing silent testimony to decades of service and sacrifice. Michael Johnston's room sat at the end of a quiet wing, carefully designed to minimize sensory overload for veterans struggling with traumatic brain injuries and post-deployment stress. Elena arrived early, her nursing background compelling her to review Johnston's latest medical reports before Atlas's first official therapeutic intervention. The clinical notes painted a challenging picture: limited verbal communication, sporadic memory recall, and significant emotional withdrawal. Traditional therapies had yielded minimal progress, leaving Johnston suspended in a liminal space between his military past and an uncertain civilian future. Colonel Harrison's experimental approach hinged on Atlas's unique capabilities. Working military dogs possessed an intuitive understanding of human emotional states that transcended conventional therapeutic methods. Michael Sullivan had documented this phenomenon extensively in his handler journals, observations that now seemed prophetic. When Atlas entered the rehabilitation room, the change was immediate and profound. His movement carried the disciplined grace of a working dog, yet something softer had emerged during his years with the Sullivan family. He approached Johnston with a calculated carefulness that spoke of both professional training and deeply personal empathy. Johnston sat motionless near the room's large window, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the physical space. Military personnel learned early to maintain a neutral exterior, but trauma carved deeper channels than training could conceal. Atlas stopped precisely 2 feet from the chair, the standard protective distance Michael had trained him to maintain. Maddie had insisted on accompanying her mother, her own journey of healing making her sensitive to the nuanced dynamics of recovery. She watched from a designated observation area, Atlas's training lead clutched in her hand, her posture reflecting the years of careful instruction she had received about working dog protocols. "Sergeant Johnston," Elena began softly, "this is Atlas. He served with a unit similar to yours. The first session was about presence more than interaction. Atlas simply existed in Johnston's space, his steady breathing and controlled movements, creating a non-threatening environment. Military working dogs understood trauma in ways human therapists could only approximate. They recognized pain without demanding conversation, offered comfort without expectation." Across town, Maddie's connection with Jason Miller continued to develop. The boy, who had initially seemed unreachable, was slowly revealing layers of complexity. His father's death in a training accident had created a wall of silence that mirrored Maddie's own early grief. During lunch periods, they began sharing carefully guarded stories. Jason spoke about military bases where his father had been stationed, the model planes he had collected, the stories that now existed only in memory. Maddie listened, Atlas's presence a subtle reminder that healing was possible. Rebecca, Elena's sister, had become increasingly involved in their evolving journey. Her background in social work provided additional perspective on the delicate rehabilitation process. She had connections with veteran support networks, resources that could prove crucial for Johnston's recovery. "This isn't just about therapy," Rebecca observed during a family dinner. "It's about rebuilding a connection to purpose." Johnston's medical team remained cautiously skeptical. Experimental interventions rarely produce dramatic results, especially with patients presenting such complex trauma profiles, yet the initial observations were promising. Atlas's presence seemed to trigger subtle neurological responses, slight changes in breathing, momentary shifts in eye focus, microscopic improvements that suggested deeper potential. Colonel Harrison's involvement went beyond professional obligation. He had known Michael Sullivan, understood the profound bond between handlers and their working dogs. This intervention represented more than a medical experiment. It was a continuation of a legacy of service and connection. The rehabilitation center's standard protocols required meticulous documentation. Elena maintained detailed logs, capturing every nuanced interaction between Atlas and Johnston. Michael's journals became both inspiration and practical guide, their margins filled with insights that now found new purpose. Maddie's school project took an unexpected turn. Inspired by her experiences, she began documenting the role of military working dogs in veteran recovery. Her research, guided by Dr. Bennett, explored the psychological mechanisms that made these animals such powerful therapeutic partners. "It's not just training," she explained to her teacher. "It's like they understand something deeper about human emotions." Jason became an unexpected collaborator, sharing details about military working dog programs his father had discussed. Their shared experience of loss created a bridge of understanding that transcended typical middle school social dynamics. Atlas's involvement with Johnston represented a delicate balance. He was simultaneously a working dog, a therapeutic asset, and a family member. The Sullivan household had learned to navigate these complex identities, understanding that Atlas's value extended far beyond traditional definitions. By the third session, subtle changes emerged. Johnston's hand, previously motionless, occasionally twitched near Atlas's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, understanding the profound nature of this minimal interaction. Military working dogs were trained to read the most minute human signals, a skill that now translated into therapeutic sensitivity. Elena recognized the significance of these moments. Her nursing experience had taught her that healing was rarely dramatic. It happened in whispers, in microscopic shifts, in connections that defied clinical explanation. Rebecca began exploring broader support networks. Johnston's case could potentially open doors for other veterans struggling with similar challenges. The intersection of working dog therapy and rehabilitation represented an innovative approach that challenged traditional treatment models. As autumn began to paint the landscape with muted colors, the rehabilitation sessions continued. Atlas moved between his roles with seamless precision. Family protector, working dog, therapeutic partner. The boundaries that once seemed clear had become beautifully blurred. Maddie's drawings began to capture these complex dynamics. Sketches of Atlas, Johnston, and the rehabilitation center filled her notebooks. Visual narratives of a healing journey that resisted simple categorization. Something profound was unfolding. Not just a therapeutic intervention, but a reimagining of connection, service, and recovery. Part 7. Broken Signals. Winter arrived with a sharp intensity that seemed to cut through the Sullivan household's carefully constructed routine. Atlas's morning patrol of the house took longer, his movements more deliberate as he checked each window and door against the cold that pressed against the glass. Something had changed, a subtle shift in the dog's behavior that Elena first noticed during her morning coffee. Michael Johnston's rehabilitation had entered a critical phase. The microscopic progress documented in previous weeks now seemed to hang in a delicate balance. Atlas's sessions had revealed unexpected complexities, layers of trauma that resisted simple therapeutic approaches. Colonel Harrison arrived unexpectedly one crisp morning, his official car cutting through the frost-covered street. The manila folder he carried looked heavier than usual, weighted with information that promised to disrupt their carefully maintained equilibrium. "We've uncovered additional information about Johnston's last deployment," Harrison began, his voice carefully modulated. The living room felt suddenly smaller, Atlas positioning himself between the Colonel and Maddie with a precision that spoke of ingrained protective instincts. The classified report detailed a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Johnston's working dog, the one from the photograph Elena had found, had been killed during an ambush. The details were clinical, stripped of emotion, but the underlying trauma screamed between the lines. Maddie's school was experiencing its own undercurrents of tension. Jason Miller's increasing withdrawal caught the attention of the school counselor. His connection with Maddie seemed to be the only consistent thread holding him to any semblance of normal social interaction. "He talks about his dad," the counselor explained to Eleanor during a conference, "but it's different now, like he's trying to understand something larger than just loss." Atlas's involvement with Johnston had begun to reveal unexpected neurological patterns. The medical team documented minute changes, slight increases in brain activity during sessions, momentary breakthroughs that suggested deeper healing was possible. Rebecca had been researching similar therapeutic interventions, connecting with veteran support networks that explored the intersection of working dogs and trauma recovery. Her findings suggested that Atlas represented something more than a traditional therapy animal. He was a bridge between military service and civilian recovery. The letter that arrived midweek came from an unexpected source. A research team from a prominent military psychology department requested detailed documentation of Atlas's interactions with Johnston. The implications were significant. This could become a landmark study in canine-assisted trauma recovery. Jason's father had been part of a specialized communications unit, a detail that gained new significance as more information emerged. His death during a training accident had always seemed to carry unresolved questions, whispers of something larger left unspoken. Elena found herself spending more time reviewing Michael's old handler journals. The dog-eared pages contained more than training notes. They were a map of understanding that seemed to anticipate the current situation. Michael had always believed that working dogs possessed an intelligence that transcended traditional understanding. Tissue Rehabilitation Center became a crucible of careful observation. Johnston's responses to Atlas defied conventional medical explanation. Moments of lucidity would emerge, brief windows where memories seemed to crystallize, only to slip away moments later. Maddie's school project took an unexpected turn. What had begun as a simple exploration of military working dogs became a deeper investigation into the psychological mechanisms of trauma and recovery. Her research, guided by Dr. Bennett, started to attract attention from local veteran support groups. Colonel Harrison's involvement suggested something more complex was at play. The carefully curated information about Johnston's mission hinted at layers of complexity that extended beyond standard medical protocols. Atlas's behavior continued to change. He would spend hours watching Johnston during their sessions, his attention more intense than typical therapeutic interactions. Elena recognized the same focused observation Michael had documented in his journals, a deep, almost telepathic connection that defied simple explanation. Rebecca's network of veteran support contacts began to take interest in the Sullivan family's unique approach. Atlas represented a potential breakthrough in understanding the profound connection between working dogs and human psychological recovery. The classified report about Johnston's final mission contained redacted sections that seemed to suggest something more significant than a routine military operation. Fragments of information hinted at a mission that had gone wrong in ways not fully explained by official documentation. Jason's increasing involvement with Maddie's research project revealed unexpected connections. His father's specialized communications background began to paint a more complex picture of military service, layers of information that existed beyond standard narratives. Winter settled over their world like a heavy blanket, muting colors and compressing time. Atlas's morning and evening patrols took on a heightened sense of purpose. Elena noticed how he would pause at specific windows, his attention focused on something beyond the physical landscape. The research team's request for documentation opened up new possibilities. Atlas was no longer just a family's companion or a therapeutic asset. He was becoming a potential key to understanding deeper mechanisms of trauma and recovery. Johnston's medical team began to recognize that something extraordinary was happening. The traditional boundaries between therapy, medical intervention, and something more ineffable were blurring. Colonel Harrison's visits became more frequent, each bringing fragments of information that suggested a larger narrative was waiting to be uncovered. The connection between Johnston, Atlas, and the Sullivan family seemed to be more than coincidental. Maddie's drawings began to change. What had once been simple sketches of Atlas and Johnston now contained more complex imagery, suggestions of connections that existed beyond the visible world, hints of something waiting to be understood. Something was emerging, a story larger than any of them yet comprehended. Part 8. Convergence. The first week of February brought a storm that seemed to carry more than just snow. Ice coated the windows of the Sullivan home, creating intricate patterns that mirrored the increasingly complex web of connections surrounding Atlas and Michael Johnston's rehabilitation. Elena discovered the encrypted flash drive tucked inside one of Michael's old military journals. Its presence felt deliberate, as if her late husband had anticipated a moment like this, a moment when fragments of a larger story would begin to align. The drive required a specialized decryption protocol that Colonel Harrison provided with uncharacteristic urgency. Each file revealed another layer of omission that had been carefully buried beneath layers of classified documentation. Johnston's unit had been involved in something far more significant than a standard deployment. Atlas's behavior had become increasingly focused. During rehabilitation sessions, he would fixate on Johnston with an intensity that suggested more than therapeutic connection. The medical team documented minute neurological responses, brain activity patterns that defied conventional explanation. Maddie's research project had transformed. What began as a school assignment about military working dogs now represented a deeply personal investigation into the complex relationships between soldiers, their canine partners, and the invisible wounds of service. Jason Miller became an unexpected ally. His father's background in military communications provided crucial context. Fragments of conversations, half-remembered stories from childhood, began to form a narrative that extended beyond simple family history. Rebecca's network of veteran support contacts grew increasingly interested in the Sullivan family's unique approach. Atlas was no longer just a therapy dog. He had become a potential key to understanding trauma recovery, a living bridge between military service and civilian healing. The classified files painted a stark picture of Johnston's final mission: a communications intercept, a compromised operation, a series of decisions that cascaded into catastrophic consequences. The dog Johnston had lost, the one from the photograph, had been more than a simple working animal. Colonel Harrison's visits became more frequent, each bringing additional fragments of information. His military bearing seemed to crack slightly, revealing a human connection to the unfolding story that went beyond official protocols. Maddie's drawings took on a new complexity. Intricate sketches depicting Atlas, Johnston, and shadowy figures from military operations covered her notebooks. Dr. Bennett noted the therapeutic value of these visual narratives, a way of processing information too complex for words. The rehabilitation center became a crucible of careful observation. Johnston's responses to Atlas defied medical explanation. Moments of absolute clarity would emerge, brief windows where memories crystallized only to dissolve moments later. Elena's nursing background proved crucial. She understood the delicate balance between medical intervention and something more intuitive. The connection that existed between Atlas and Johnston transcended traditional therapeutic approaches. Winter pressed against the windows, a constant reminder of the cold that seemed to pervade Johnston's memories. Atlas would spend hours watching him during their sessions, his attention a tangible force that seemed to bridge impossible distances. The encrypted files revealed a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. A communications breakdown, a series of decisions made under extreme pressure, a moment that had shattered an entire unit. Johnston's working dog had been more than a partner. She had been a crucial link in a chain of survival. Jason's involvement brought unexpected depth to their investigation. His father's specialized communications background provided context that extended beyond standard military narratives. Conversations with Maddie revealed connections that seemed to exist in the spaces between known information. Rebecca's research uncovered a network of veteran support initiatives that went far beyond traditional rehabilitation approaches. Atlas represented a potential breakthrough in understanding the profound connection between working dogs and human psychological recovery. Colonel Harrison's involvement suggested something more complex was at play. The carefully curated information about Johnston's mission hinted at layers of complexity that extended beyond standard military protocols. The medical team tracking Johnston's rehabilitation began to recognize that something extraordinary was happening. Traditional boundaries between therapy, medical intervention, and something more ineffable were blurring. Maddie's understanding of Atlas's role continued to evolve. She saw him not just as a family protector or a therapeutic asset, but as a living repository of experiences that defied simple categorization. Elena found herself spending more time with Michael's handler journals. The dog-eared pages contained more than training notes. They were a map of understanding that seemed to anticipate the current situation. Michael had always believed that working dogs possessed an intelligence that transcended traditional understanding. The research team's interest intensified. What had begun as a simple documentation request now represented a potential breakthrough in understanding canine-assisted trauma recovery. Atlas's morning and evening patrols took on a heightened sense of purpose. He would pause at specific windows, his attention focused on something beyond the physical landscape, a connection that existed in realms beyond immediate perception. Johnston's fragmented memories began to align in unexpected ways. Moments of clarity would emerge during Atlas's sessions, brief windows where the past and present seemed to overlap, creating a narrative that extended beyond individual experience. The storm outside seemed to mirror the internal turbulence of their investigation. Something was emerging, a story larger than any of them had initially comprehended. Atlas stood as a silent witness, a living bridge between past and present, between loss and recovery. A convergence was approaching. The boundaries between mission, memory, and healing were about to dissolve. The encrypted files arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier with military precision that seemed to vibrate with unspoken urgency. Elena spread the documents across the kitchen table, Atlas positioning himself nearby with a watchful intensity that suggested he understood more than a typical dog would. Michael Johnston's medical records told one story. The classified documents told another entirely. The mission that had fractured Johnston's world was not a simple military operation. It was a complex communications intercept that had gone catastrophically wrong, involving a network of specialized intelligence operatives whose connections extended far beyond standard military protocols. Jason Miller's growing involvement brought unexpected depth to their investigation. His father's background in military communications provided context that seemed to exist in the spaces between known information. Conversations with Maddie revealed connections that defied simple explanation. Colonel Harrison's visits had become more frequent, each bringing additional fragments of information that suggested a larger narrative waiting to be uncovered. His military bearing seemed to crack slightly, revealing a human connection to the unfolding story that went beyond official channels. Atlas's behavior during rehabilitation sessions had become increasingly focused. The medical team documented neurological responses that challenged everything they understood about canine-assisted therapy. Moments of connection between Johnston and the dog transcended traditional therapeutic boundaries. Rebecca's network of veteran support contacts had been tracking the Sullivan family's unique approach. Atlas was no longer just a therapy dog. He had become a potential key to understanding trauma recovery, a living bridge between military service and civilian healing. The rehabilitation center had transformed into a crucible of careful observation. Johnston's responses defied medical explanation. Moments of absolute clarity would emerge, brief windows where memories crystallized only to dissolve moments later. Maddie's research had evolved into something far more complex than a simple school project. Her notebooks were filled with intricate drawings that mapped connections between Atlas, Johnston, and shadowy figures from military operations. Dr. Bennett noted the therapeutic value of these visual narratives, a way of processing information too complex for words. The classified files painted a stark picture of a mission that had unraveled in ways not captured by official documentation. A communications breakdown, a series of decisions made under extreme pressure, a moment that had shattered an entire unit of specialized operatives. Winter pressed against the windows of the Sullivan home, a constant reminder of the cold that seemed to pervade Johnston's memories. Atlas would spend hours watching him during their sessions, his attention a tangible force that seemed to bridge impossible distances. Elena's nursing background proved crucial in navigating the complex medical and emotional terrain. She understood the delicate balance between medical intervention and something more intuitive. The connection between Atlas and Johnston transcended traditional therapeutic approaches. Jason Miller became an unexpected source of critical information. Conversations with Maddie revealed fragments of his father's work, specialized communication protocols, encrypted message systems, a world of information that existed between spoken words. The encrypted files contained more than mission reports. They suggested a network of connections that extended beyond standard military operations, fragments of communication intercepts, partial mission logs, references to specialized units that existed in the shadows of official military structure. Colonel Harrison's involvement suggested something more complex was at play. The carefully curated information about Johnston's mission hinted at layers of complexity that extended beyond standard military protocols. His visits became less formal, more conspiratorial. Maddie's understanding of Atlas's role continued to evolve. She saw him not just as a family protector or a therapeutic asset, but as a living repository of experiences that defied simple categorization. Her drawings became more intricate, mapping connections that existed beyond visible perception. The research team's interest had intensified. What had begun as a simple documentation request now represented a potential breakthrough in understanding. Canine-assisted trauma recovery. Atlas was becoming more than a subject of study. He was a key to unlocking a larger mystery. Johnston's fragmented memories began to align in unexpected ways. Moments of clarity would emerge during Atlas's sessions, brief windows where past and present seemed to overlap, creating a narrative that extended beyond individual experience. Rebecca's research uncovered a network of veteran support initiatives that went far beyond traditional rehabilitation approaches. The connection between working dogs and psychological recovery represented a frontier of understanding that challenged existing medical paradigms. The medical team tracking Johnston's rehabilitation began to recognize that something extraordinary was happening. Traditional boundaries between therapy, medical intervention, and something more ineffable were blurring. Elena found herself spending more time with Michael's handler journals. The dog-eared pages contained more than training notes. They were a map of understanding that seemed to anticipate the current situation. Michael had always believed that working dogs possessed an intelligence that transcended traditional understanding. Atlas's morning and evening patrols took on a heightened sense of purpose. He would pause at specific windows, his attention focused on something beyond the physical landscape, a connection that existed in realms beyond immediate perception. The storm of information continued to build. Fragments of Johnston's mission, Atlas's inexplicable responses, the complex network of connections suggested by the encrypted files, all pointed to something larger waiting to be understood. A convergence was approaching. The boundaries between mission, memory, and healing were about to dissolve completely. The final piece clicked into place on a crisp spring morning. Atlas stood at the center of a revelation that would reshape everything. They understood about military service, trauma, and healing. Michael Johnston's fragmented memories, Atlas's unexplained connection, and the encrypted files converged in a moment of absolute clarity. The mission that had been buried was more than a military operation. It was a turning point that connected lives across time and trauma. Elena, Maddie, Colonel Harrison, and Johnston sat together as the full story emerged. A communications network that had saved lives, a dog that had been more than a working animal, a bond that transcended traditional understanding of service and sacrifice. Atlas watched, silent and knowing, the living bridge between past and present. Maddie's research would become a groundbreaking study. Johnston found a path to healing. The Sullivan family discovered a purpose larger than their individual stories. Some mysteries remain, some connections defy explanation, but some bonds between soldiers, between humans and animals, between loss and hope, are unbreakable.